All right, we're going to go ahead and get started on today's webinar. So welcome to another Mathematic webinar. Today we are hosting a webinar with our friends at Sunrise Labs. So we're very pleased to have Christopher Perry with us today. We're going to be talking about risk management for medical devices and how to get everyone speaking the same language. Before I turn it over to Chris, I do have a few housekeeping notes that I would like to go over. And you know what? I never introduced myself. So hi, I'm Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications for Mathematic. If you're not familiar with our organization, we are a membership-based trade association that works to bolster the med device industry primarily in New England through education and networking, awareness, and advocacy. This event is being recorded today, so everyone who registered for the event will receive a copy of the webinar after, and we're going to be able to share the slides as well. So you'll get that in a follow-up email after the webinar ends today. We are also going to have ample time for Q&A. So anytime that you have a question throughout the webinar, please feel free to put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then we will do our best to answer all those questions for you when we get to that portion of the webinar. All right, now I am pleased to turn it over to our presenter for today, Christopher Perry. He is the Senior Principal Systems Engineer for Sunrise Labs, and he is going to take it away. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Nicole. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me. So risk management is a substantial part of what Sunrise System team does, and we've collectively built numerous risk management files, so we understand its benefits and features. I put together this presentation to try and get everyone to better understand the importance of risk management. It is an invaluable tool that helps create safer devices more quickly with fewer regulatory challenges. Now, to be very clear, we're talking specifically about device system safety to patients, bystanders, and operators. Program risks and business risks will be treated in a similar way, but that's out of scope for this presentation. Go move to the next slide. So what exactly is risk management? Well, per ISO 14971, it's the systematic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the task of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk. Quite the word salad. So why do we actually need risk management? Well, it's central to the FDA and the EU MDR approval processes. It's ensconced in the regulations. It's also key aspects of the consensus standards that we're expected to comply with. IEC 60601, IEC 61010, ISO 14708, they all have clauses that dictate that you need a risk management process in the development of your products. But I would argue that you really should want it as well. If you can get your leadership and engineering team to internalize how risk management works, it has various benefits. Right off the bat, being able to identify hazards and failure modes early in the program when you've got a little more flexibility in your design, a little bit more schedule flexibility is invaluable. And getting that sort of stuff flushed out early in the process. As technical issues come up, risk management can use to help triage them and figure out which ones are really, really important and which ones you can probably safely defer or delay work on. It allows you to better communicate to all your stakeholders how you're going to manage and make your device safe. It's a one-stop shop for that information. It can help you make architecture decisions. You can compare different device ideas against the requirements that you come up with in this process and figure out which ones meet the preponderance of them and which ones don't. And that can help you make the decision about which direction to go in. It can help your test teams figure out, well, what do I have to test and how might I go about testing it? And it also, I like to say, is it's really good at helping you figure out when you're done. When you've identified everything that you know of that can go wrong and you've figured out what you're going to do about it, and you verify that all those things that you intend to do have been done, you have a safe enough product to consider submitting. I like to say that the proper execution of risk management ensures that we have done our best to avoid people getting hurt with our devices. Central to the process are the steps of analyzing, evaluating, and controlling. And frequent issues that come up is getting everyone to understand how that actually works. Virtually every hazard analysis review, FMEA review meeting I've ever facilitated, we always spend a large amount of time discussing the terms and the logical flow of the process. So this presentation is going to try and give you an outline and a thinking process for how that's supposed to work, and walk you through some examples. First, let's start off with the terms that are used in this process. And these are all straight from ISO 14971. Risk, combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. Harm, injury or damage to health of people or damage to property or the environment. Severity, measure of the possible consequences of a hazard. Hazard, potential source of harm. Hazardous situation, circumstance in which people, property, or the environment are exposed to one or more hazards. Risk control, process in which decisions are made and measures are implemented by which risks are reduced to or maintained within specified levels. Residual risk, risk remaining after risk control measures have been implemented. Safety, free from unacceptable risk. Note in this list, I haven't included the term mitigation. It doesn't appear in 14971. The term has been deprecated since at least the 2000 edition of the standard. And in fact, an organization I previously worked for actually got an audit observation for including that term in their SOP. So we should avoid using the term mitigation. We really should be thinking in terms of risk control. So those terms can be a little cryptic, particularly that definition for risk controls. So having a mental model can help figure out how that all fits together. And honestly, without that, even seasoned engineers often debate the specifics of those terms. The example I like to use is crossing the street. You can analyze all aspects of the risk management process using this example. So we'll put those terms in the context of crossing the street. Harm, the injury received by being struck by a car. We're going to focus on that in this example, i.e. blunt force trauma. Severity, how bad is the injury received by being struck by the car? Cuts and bruises, broken bones, etc. Hazards. In this case, we're going to say moving objects, and this is kind of derived from the list that's in 14971. Hazardous situation, pedestrian in the path of oncoming traffic. Some might say stepping into the street, but that's not strictly accurate. If you're in the street and there's no car coming, you could be there all day and there's no hazard. It's the act of being in the oncoming traffic that is actually the hazardous situation. Risk. Everyone would agree that blindly stepping into the street is risky, i.e. not free from unacceptable risk. Risk control measures. What do? We generally look both ways before we step into the street, waiting for approaching car to pass, requiring drivers to yield to pedestrians, speed limits, zoning rules for visibility, making sure that you can actually see up and down the street, street lights. Note that the first three risk controls in this example are kind of equivalent to patient training or operator training, and the latter are more like design features. Residual risk. I think everyone would agree that, as a society, if you do all those things, that the risk associated with stepping in the street is acceptable, i.e. free from unacceptable risk. We certainly could do more, but as a society, we've agreed that that's enough. Let's talk a little bit about probability of occurrence. This is how likely a harm will occur when you're in that hazardous situation, or will result from that hazardous situation. It can be broken down into two probabilities. There's P1, probability that a hazardous situation occurs, and there's P2, probability of a hazardous situation leading to the harm. And the overall probability is the product of those two probabilities. So in the context of the street crossing exercise, P1 would be how probable is it that there's an oncoming car when the pedestrian steps into the street? So for this example, we'll say occasionally, let's say 10 times a day. P2 in the context of crossing the street is how probable is a type of injury to occur if a pedestrian is in fact struck by the car. So cuts and bruises, yeah, pretty much can guarantee that you're going to have those if you get hit by a car. Sprains and broken bones, pretty likely, at least half the time. It's a reasonable estimate. Internal injuries requiring hospitalization, less, but at least 1 in 10 times. It's a good estimate. So combining those, we get cuts and bruises. If you blindly step into the street, yeah, as much as 10 times a day. Sprains and broken bones, yeah, you at least have 5 times a day in this example. Injuries that require hospitalization, yeah, it's completely believable that 1 time a day you could get struck by a car and have to go to the hospital if you just blindly step into the street. So how do risk controls work? I want to talk a little bit more about that. They really fall mostly into 3 principal categories. There's risk controls that reduce P1. That would be the training that tells you to look both ways and wait for cars to pass. That reduces the likelihood of being in the path of oncoming traffic. Reducing P2, speed limit would be an example of that. By slowing the car down, the seriousness of the injuries that happen when there actually is a collision between the pedestrian and the vehicle is reduced potentially. There's a third category. You can interrupt the sequence of events, i.e. removing the need to step into the street altogether. It doesn't necessarily apply in this particular example because we're on a residential street, but pedestrian overpass on a multi-lane highway would be an example of removing the need to be in the path of oncoming traffic. Those of you that know ISO 14971 know that there are provisions for assessing residual risk with lower severities after the application of risk controls. This is an example where that would be acceptable. Now let's look at how this process gets started. You need some pieces in place before you actually start doing the analysis, kind of 3 legs to the stool, so to speak. You need an intended use or purpose defined. I like to say this is the what's it for, who's it for, what's the environment. In the crossing the street example, this would be like safe transit of pedestrians and vehicles on local streets is what this is for. We're trying to analyze and develop a way to ensure that. Who's it for? All ambulatory individuals, including wheelchair users. What's the environment? It's outside environment, day or night, all seasons. Then you need a basic description of the system. In the crossing street example, we're talking about a typical paved residential street with sidewalks, lined with single-family homes in a municipality that provides services, enforces laws and regulations. So that's your kind of bounding box of what you're analyzing. And then lastly, you need your criteria for risk acceptability. And this is usually a risk acceptability matrix. This is what combinations of severity and probability are acceptable and what combinations are unacceptable. If you haven't got these 3 things when you start, you really need to reach out to your leadership and try and get these things established right off the bat so that you have a firm set of ground rules for what you're analyzing and whether you need to do something about the various things you come up with. So how do you organize the file itself? There's essentially 3 principal parts. First off, there's the hazard analysis, and this is what hazards are inherent in the use of the device in the intended application. And the crossing the street example is what can go wrong when you cross the street. The hazard analysis is generally agnostic to design details, but is framed by the intended use in the design description. It has the broadest audience, so it needs to be fairly high level, but it needs to cover all the foreseeable hazards. And if you need examples to start with, table C1 in 14971 has a nice long list of examples that you can choose from and kind of get the process started. If you come up with ones that are not on that list, that's totally acceptable too. And in addition to that, you don't have to include every one of the ones in that list. You only have to include the ones that can reasonably be attributable to your device or system. The next piece, design FMEAs. This is what about the device or system can go wrong. And the crossing street example, it's what can go wrong with a car, cracked windshield, worn tires, etc. Then there's what can go wrong on the street. Streetlights failing, overgrowth of bushes. That would be examples of things that should be analyzed on the hardware side of the system. Then there's the use FMEA. What mistakes can the patient, caregiver, operator commit? And what are we going to do about those? In the crossing street examples, it's vehicle and pedestrian. How can they make a mistake that can put them in harm's way? The last, very important, is that this use FMEA feeds directly into human factors testing. So this dovetails very, very nicely with IEC 60601-1-6, which is the usability standard. One more term before we go any farther: foreseeable misuse, reasonably foreseeable misuse. This is the use of a product or a system in a way not intended by the manufacturer, but can result from readily predictable human behavior. This includes behavior of lay and professional users. It can be intentional or unintentional, but this does not mean malicious misuse necessarily. And more importantly, this is also not how an engineer would use the device. This can be a challenge for the team. You really have to think in terms of how your spouse or your children or your neighbors or your parents would use it, not how your team members can figure out how to game it. Along those lines, I wanted to point out that if you have the opportunity to watch human factors testing or get your team to watch it, extremely illuminating, highly recommend you do so. It's really surprising what you'll learn when you do this. Been on teams where we wrung our hands about use errors that we thought were really going to be a problem and that we're going to have to struggle to fix, that never showed up in human factors testing at all. It's not like we took those out of our analysis, but we were able to rank those a little bit more reasonably based on what the human factors testing told us. Likewise, there's a number of situations where use errors came up that we never even dreamed of. Quite frankly, you can't consider your use FMEA complete unless you have done your human factors testing. So let's look at the structure of these various documents. I've got here a couple of lines of a cross from the street hazard analysis. Now note the column order. It's organized by hazard. Then you have the cause, sequence of events, hazard situation, and then you go into your risk assessment, your harm, your severity, your probability, your risk. Then your risk controls, then your residual risk assessment. And then I add this little column in here, notes, which I use to fill in some blanks, kind of explain why I might have made a certain assessment of severity, how a risk control might actually serve to reduce the risk of harm. So let me go through this first example. We already talked about moving objects, pedestrian and vehicle fail to avoid contact as the cause of the harm in this situation. Sequence of events: pedestrian steps into the street when a vehicle is approaching, vehicle fails to stop and hits the pedestrian. I'll jump ahead here to the risk controls. I've included the risk controls we talked about before. And then the residual risk assessment is, it's pretty unlikely that we'll end up with a high severity harm if we do all those things. So as a society, we generally would agree that the risk is acceptable. And I have notes here to explain why speed limits are useful, i.e., if you just keep cars going slower, it gives the operator more time to respond to the patient being, the pedestrian being in the street, and also reduces the severity of harm if there is collision between the two of them. Now note in the first line, I only considered the highest severity. Depending on how your risk acceptability matrix is constructed, that might not actually be the combination that presents the highest risk. You may well be in situations where perhaps a lower severity harm happening a lot more often might actually be worse. So be careful about that. You might have to analyze a couple of different scenarios, a couple of different combinations to figure out which ones are really the worst. And you might want to have either multiple lines in the hazard analysis, or you might want to at least explain in the notes why you chose a specific severity level if it's not obvious. Another important thing here is that you really want to assess the risk here in the middle, assuming that you haven't done anything to reduce probability yet. Think clean sheet of paper, a Neanderthal stepping into the street, not knowing anything about our social mores, or a toddler, for instance. This is important because you want to make an honest assessment of what the risk is before you do anything about it. Because if the risk is already acceptable and you don't do that exercise, you might be applying risk controls that actually aren't necessary. And that adds cost and time. And the second line here is an example of a situation where that makes sense. I took the hazard of falling. Pedestrian loses their balance is the cause. The sequence of events is a pedestrian trips while stepping up the curb, leading to a fall. Hazard situation is fall, blunt trauma again. And I was slightly conservative in my assessment of severity here. I said medium. It's certainly foreseeable that if you did trip, you might break your wrist, for instance. So I took that as the highest level of severity that I would expect if you tripped. But when's the last time anybody on this call saw somebody trip when they stepped out of a street and break their wrist? It's extremely rare, so much so that as a society, we really don't do anything about that potential harm in our design of our streets. Yes, we have curb cuts, but that's really about usability. It's not so much about reducing the risk of these sorts of injuries. And if you hadn't done that risk assessment, you might have been tempted to add risk controls when in fact, we as a society don't see the need for them. Next, let's go on to design FMEA. Now, in this case, you can look at the column order. It's similar, but slightly different. In this case, rather than organizing by hazards, we're organizing by component. And we're going to break down the different components of the system and look at the way they fail. And that's what the second column is what the failure mode of those components are. And then from there on, the column order is the same and the analysis is the same. So let's just walk through this example here. We'll start off with the street as the component. What can go wrong with the street? Well, the street and the driver's views can be blocked. And that can be, the cause can be overgrowth of foliage. And the sequence of events is the two can't see each other before the pedestrian steps into the path of the oncoming car. They get hit, blunt force trauma, and it can be pretty serious as much as once a day if they're not careful. So we have additional risk controls. The city and state are obliged to keep the foliage trimmed. We too teach our novice drivers and our children to be extra careful when they can't see clearly up and down the streets. But speed limits are still effective at helping to reduce this harm, the severity of this harm, if and when this situation occurs. And with those risk controls, we would argue it's acceptable. And the notes here are explaining again how that speed limit actually serves to help. Notice, though, that we're reusing risk controls, and that's not only acceptable, it's strongly recommended. I've been on programs where teams have gone to great lengths to design the perfect risk control for every single failure mode, but there was almost no commonality to them. When I came in and I said, hey, we can use more generic risk controls that are arguably just as effective and use them for multiple risk controls, and we end up with fewer requirements to verify. Similar here for the second line, just for another example, we'll look at the component being the vehicle. Pedestrian driver view is, excuse me, in this case, it's really the driver's view is blocked because they have a scratched or cracked windshield. So look ahead here to our risk controls, and I said, okay, well, annual vehicle inspection would serve to help reduce the likelihood of this harm occurring. And I note in the notes column that vehicle inspection would include a check of the windshield. This structure is also useful for software FMEAs. So when we're talking about design FMEAs, we're not talking just about electrical and mechanical, but it can also be used for software. And the component would generally be the module. And the failure mode might be things like buffer overflow or invalid data, out of bounds values. And so this applies there equally and will work just as effectively for addressing the necessary causes in IEC 62304. Use FMEA, again, similar, but the first two columns are different. This case, we organize by task. What are the tasks associated with, living near or crossing streets, and what errors can be committed when you're undertaking those tasks. So in this case, I said, well, you got to operate the vehicle. That's one of the tasks. And the use error, the operator can be distracted by a cell phone. So that the operator doesn't see the pedestrian in time, and the operator ends up striking the pedestrian. So we've got a new risk control. Use of handheld devices is prohibited. But risk controls like looking both ways and waiting for cars to pass are also effective in this situation, and speed limits are as well. Another one that I added for just to demonstrate another little nuance, staying clear of the street is another task that you need to do if you don't intend to cross the street. Entering the street when a vehicle is approaching is the use error. Sequence of events, child chasing a ball, enters the street while the vehicle is approaching and the operator isn't able to stop in time. In this case, speed limits are a risk control. Oh, before I go there though, I noted that I did treat the highest severity, but I actually upped the probability somewhat because obviously children are more likely to receive serious injuries from being struck by vehicles. And so that's been noted here in the notes that I explained why that probability is elevated. In addition to the fact that we use speed limits and that we do have additional driver training where we make sure that drivers not only pay attention to what's in the street, but also on either sides of the street. And then we often have signage indicating where playgrounds and school zones are. Also, a nice thing about this notes column is that it's really useful for noting when observations in formative testings occur for a particular task. You can note it, whether the line item was added or that you dreamed it up and found that it actually did happen. Noting it there is a good way to keep track of which entries actually trace directly to observations. So, what is the output of this whole process? Generally, as I mentioned before, those risk controls generally get instantiated as requirements, and they usually fall under roughly 3 categories. Design requirements. In the crossing the street example, this would be zoning rules and street lights. Labeling requirements, which is things like speed limits, playgrounds, school zone signs. Training, looking both ways, waiting for cars to pass, yielding to pedestrians. You've got this list of requirements now that is in supplement to what you want your device to do to meet the claims and what features you want it to have for marketability. And that now you can use those requirements also to inform, for instance, design. You can use that as your criteria for what it is to make it the actual hardware safe. The labeling is what's in your IFU, and the training is what's going to be in your training material. Next output is presumably now you have consensus among your team. We all know what we're supposed to be doing. And so there should be fewer debates about exactly what should we be implementing. In addition to that is that when management goes, well, this looks bad, what are we doing about it? You can walk them through that logic and explain to them, yep, we've got this. It's under control. This is what we're going to do about it. As I mentioned before, you can, now that you've got a list of design requirements, you can use those design requirements as a checklist for evaluating proof of concept hardware. If the proof of concept checks all the boxes for all those design requirements, it's a concept that's worth going forward with. If it doesn't, you know that there are areas in your proof of concept that you're going to have to go back and revisit in order for it to meet those requirements. Ultimately, you could also revisit the requirements and look for alternatives. Either way, it shows you where there's a gap between your proof of concept and what you need in order to make sure your device is going to be safe. In addition to that, now that you've got this collective of requirements for how you're going to meet the claims and how you're going to make sure that it's marketable, you also have safety requirements. Tracing the ones that are used for safety allows you to prioritize those, because if you haven't got a safe product, it doesn't matter what the marketing requirements and what the claims are. It lets you prioritize and get those out of the way first so that you can then spend your energy on making sure you meet your claims and making sure you meet your marketing needs. When problems come up, it allows you to triage them. If you've come across a problem and there's already a line item in your risk management file about what you're going to do about it, now you don't have to scramble. You already know what the marching orders are. If it's not in a risk management file, you'll know that you have to make an update your risk management file, add that entry so that you can then get consensus on now what are we going to do about this new thing we learned. As I mentioned before, this also helps the test team, because now the test team can look at all of those requirements that are there for safety and can look through the risk management file and figure out, okay, what failure modes and hazards are those intended to be risk controls for? What were the sequence of events that led to that potential harm. Let's test those risk controls against those sequence events and make sure that those risk controls actually work. So you get a more robust test strategy, and it gives the test team a really good starting point for their effort. Lastly, you get a nice collective overall risk assessment of, all right, this is what risk profile the device has. And if it's acceptable, you know that you've done enough. You've got the right requirements. And when those are demonstrated to work, you've got a device that is safe enough to actually consider submitting and marketing. So are there any questions?
Awesome, Chris. Thank you so much. We have lots of comments coming in through the Q&A function. Thank you so much, everybody who's writing in. Tons of comments on great presentation. This is awesome information. But let's dig into a few of the questions. And, feel free, if your question has not been answered, feel free to still put in your questions. Okay, here we go. When you set probability of occurrence, how do you know you got it right?
Well, you have to get the, if you're pulling from the predefined list that's been established in your risk management plan, it's an estimate. And you need to get consensus across your team that, does this pass the sniff test? This is an estimate, that all of these are estimates. This is really just about ranking, making sure you identify all the different things that can go wrong, rank them to figure out which ones you need to do something about. And you make your best estimate. Will it be right? More often than not, they usually are. The wisdom of a team of 3 to 4 engineers is usually good at establishing what a good baseline is. If you discover it's not, then you go back and you revise your risk management plan and act on that information. The entire risk management process is a living process. You start with a starting point, your first best guess. And as you go through the process and you learn more, you go back and you edit it and you revise it continuously to act on new information. So I wouldn't sweat too much did I get it right off the bat? Make your first best guess. Just make sure it passes. You just think about it. Put it in this context of, all right, if this was the crossing the street example, would it make sense? And use that as your starting point, and then go back, and you're going to have to periodically revisit that. If you look at 4971, it says that you have to have periodic reviews of that file to make sure that you've acted on new information. That's usually, if you made an error somewhere in there, those are the sorts of times in which you have the opportunity to revisit that and revise them accordingly.
Okay, great. Here's our next one. Okay, regarding risk analysis, according to ISO 14971, 2019, we cannot use FMEA only, right?
That's correct.
Okay, and then there's the second part. Secondly, can we use the instructions for users as a risk control measure according to the same ISO as referenced?
Yes, you can. Now, this is interesting. This actually touches on a topic that because my team has discussions about periodically. There were earlier versions of the BSEN 14971 that had an Annex ZA that talked about the notion that you couldn't use labeling as a risk control. Essentially, what that was trying to communicate, and the consensus among the industry people that I've spoken with, is that means you just can't list a bunch of warnings and cautions and say, that's it, we're done. You can use training in the label and instructions in the guide as risk controls, but you can't just sweep everything under the wood by saying, well, we told you so. And that's essentially where there was a lot of controversy. Now, there's been revisions since then that have kind of clarified and lessened the rancor about that. I still think it's prudent to make sure that if you're going to use labeling, that labeling should very, very specifically be used in the form of training, very extensive instructions, and not just simply in the form of warnings and cautions. I view it as, I take the safe route. I don't use warnings and cautions as, I do not list warnings and cautions as a justification for reducing likelihood. I'll include them as a disclosure saying, we're disclosing this to the patient. I will only use training and in actual instructions. This is how you do this. This is what you shouldn't do this is how to use the device correctly. I'll take credit for those, but I generally will not take credit for warnings and cautions.
Okay, good to know. And then there's a third part of this question asking if there are any FDA guidance documents specifically related to risk management.
I should know this. They're talked about, there's a little bit in there. I can't recall them off the top of my head if there are, and which ones are particularly useful. If that person's interested in forwarding me some contact information, I can do some digging. You can also go to the FDA website and search their guidance documents for risk management, and they'll come up. So that's usually the thing I recommend first. And if they don't have satisfaction, they can reach out to me and I could point them to a possible reference.
Okay, great. And how should people reach out to you? What's the best way?
C. Perry at sunrise.com. Excuse me, sunriselabs.com.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about how to resolve disagreements with the team that inevitably arise, deciding to harm, e.g. tripping could lead to a skull fracture and death, but the expected result is just minor discomfort? And B, determining the probability and severity ratings. For example, is exposure identifiable, patient data, a low, medium, or high severity? How do you decide?
What was the second half of that?
Okay, let's take it one part at a time. Can you talk about how to resolve disagreements with the team that arise, deciding the level of harm, for example?
Yep. So the way I usually have dealt with that is, okay, if there's disagreement on which level we should analyze, I'll analyze all of them. I'll just put line items in for all of them. And that way everybody gets their say. And then they get their say. It's a more comprehensive analysis. It might be a little bit more verbose, but at least all that information is captured. And then you can use that to also go through the exercise. As I mentioned, just because you pick the highest severity doesn't necessarily mean you arrived at the highest risk. So this is a classic example of where, yeah, you might worry about fractured skull, but it's so unlikely that it actually presents a lower risk than the notion of breaking a wrist, right? So put all the line items in, analyze them all, and then there's no question about, well, did we miss something? No, you didn't, because you included the whole thing.
Okay. And then what about determining the probability and severity ratings? How do you go about doing that?
Well, I think you suggested whether or not there might be research on that. I have actually done searches of various federal agencies' databases to establish likelihoods of things. Classic cases, I was working in a prosthetic and a question came up from the FDA about, well, people can reach into an oven with this arm and what's the likelihood that their arm will catch fire? So I actually looked at the National Fire Safety Database for how often people get injured when they reach into ovens and used that to establish a likelihood. And where it's able to establish that my likelihoods actually made sense, my probabilities of harm actually made sense. So yeah, you absolutely can look at that stuff. There's nothing wrong with just doing an estimate from the vast majority of them. But if there's areas where you're particularly concerned or there's a lot of disagreement about what those likelihoods are, you can go and use those databases. And by the way, that's a great place to put in the notes column. We arrived at this probability by searching this database, and this is where that information was found. So that's really a great way to note that when you feel that you need to ground that probability on some kind of data.
Okay. And this is kind of an offshoot of that question. Maybe it's the same, but let me just clarify this. Like, what methods do you ensure that the team is doing the proper breadth and depth? Obviously, risk management can encompass so many things. How do you declare when you're done?
Well, like I said, with the hazard analysis, you go through and you look at all the most obvious stuff. And that's why I was suggesting that you look at that table C1 and 14971. It's a very comprehensive list of hazards. So your hazard analysis, if you pick all the most reasonable ones in those for your application, you've got a pretty comprehensive list. And so if you look at all of those and how those hazards, you dream them up, every one that everyone thinks are as a reasonable sequence of events that can lead to a particular hazard is captured in hazard analysis, you've got a good hazard analysis to start with. Again, there are multiple gates in this process where you have to go back and re-review your risk management file, where you add new stuff as you go along. But that first baseline, as long as you've gone through and you've listed everything that you can think of, that's good enough, because you will definitely learn stuff as you go through the process. But that doesn't mean that your first pass was inadequate. It just means that it's an evolution of knowledge. With respect to DFMEAs, there's a few different techniques. If you look at the old mill specs on how they do FMEAs, they do it right from the component on up, screws, nuts, bolts, stuff like that. That's pretty laborious. I only do that for safety critical, like safety systems, like safety subsystems that are designed to react to very specific things. I might do a bottom-up analysis of every transistor and every resistor and capacitor. But generally what I'll do is on the hardware side, I'll break it down to a module. This module does a particular job. How can it fail at that job? And those are the failure modes that I'll look at, sort of like software modules in a software FMEA. I'm not looking at every line of code. I'm looking at a module. What are its inputs? What are its outputs? What can it do wrong? How can it break? And make sure I include all those things. And if you go through that exercise on the design FMEA side, that's a very strong starting point. And I wouldn't get too worried about, did I do enough? By the time you get through the process, you'll generally feel, yeah, I think I've got everything. I can't think of anything that I missed. And that's the state you want to be in. I can't think of anything I missed. That's good. And then the UFMEA, as I mentioned, is you want to go through every step of the treatment, every step of the device's use, all the different scenarios it's used, every step of that process, and look at all the ways that can go wrong, how a typical user might do it wrong, and include those in your FMEA. That's your good starting point. And then you want to do your human factors testing, your formative testing. Go through your formative testing, and you want to do enough formative testing so that you stop learning new things with every, once you've gone through a formative test, you're going to do multiples. When the last human formative test that you didn't teach you anything new, you've probably done enough formatives. And every one of the observations that you had in that formative needs to go in your FMEA, and you need to note it. And then you have a complete enough UFMEA to then inform what your labeling and your training needs to be, what UI elements have to be tweaked, how the hardware might have to be tweaked. And then you'll be in a good position to start considering what your script for your summative study is going to have to be.
Okay, awesome. We do have a question about, so patient safety is the theme here, including supporting FMEA. They're asking about, what about cybersecurity FMEA?
Yep. I consider it kind of a parallel analysis, and it should use, there's two things I'd like to say about that in particular. One is that its structure is going to be fairly similar in terms of what's from the left to the right. It should be structured a bit like a DFMEA for software. But depending on whether or not you're using the GIST standard or CBSS ranking, you may end up with additional columns. And so that's kind of a whole separate presentation we can go into. The important thing, I would argue, is that when you're looking at when you're defining your severity levels for a VFMEA, you want to make sure that at least the higher level severities for the VFMEA and your safety assessment, this risk management file, should be copacetic. They should have similar sorts of levels. You'll probably have additional lower level severities like loss of personal information, business risks associated with it, which is what NIST requires you to include. So those should be ranked, obviously less than safety. So you might end up actually with more than 5 levels of severity in your VFMEA. But as long as the upper levels, the ones that have to do with patient safety and operator safety, are included, then you've got a 1-to-1 correlation in your, and you use a similar probability scale from a VFMEA, then you're talking about the same risks in both cases. And doing that really simplifies how to relate the information that the VFMEA gives you in the context of patient safety. So there's should be some overlap, but they are treated differently.
Okay, great. Could you expand on the difference between mitigation and risk control a little?
Well, mitigation was the term that was used way back, and I think it was actually in the mil spec. I think tacitly you could argue that they're more or less the same thing. It's just that the standard committee, for whatever reason, decided that the term mitigation was not suitable, and they switched to risk control. And so that's why they really would prefer to see that term used. I mean, obviously in colloquial language, you can use the term, but I would avoid using it in written materials.
Okay. I'm going to ask you to define something else, Chris. Can you define criteria for risk acceptability, please?
Yes. Okay. So I have additional slides for this because I suspected this sort of a question would come up. You need to do two things to start with. First, you need to spell out levels of severity in an unambiguous way. You need to define them. And I just plucked this table pluck this table from our SOP. So this is just a starting point. We'll usually start with this, and then for whatever product we're working on, we'll tweak it as necessary to make it match that product. So you see there's 5 levels of severity, all the way from negligible to catastrophic. Negligible is essentially more or less, cuts and bruises, nothing that would require more than a Band-Aid. Minor might be laceration, broken bone, something like that. We might consider a small broken bone. Serious is something where you need to get to the hospital, and you're going to probably need surgical intervention. Critical is you're permanently impaired. It's irreversible damage. Catastrophic, life threatening. So that's just for a more sophisticated product with a slightly higher risk profile. You need 5. For a simpler one, you probably could get away with just 3 levels, probably knock off the top 2 for simpler devices. I don't recommend more than 5 levels of that. Additional granularity doesn't really buy you very much and just makes the analysis more cumbersome. Then you need to establish levels for, it jumped over it. You need to establish levels for probability. And so here we have 5 levels for our generic template. Again, for simpler devices, you could probably get away with fewer levels. So anywhere from improbable, which almost never happens, to remote. Yeah, it might happen occasionally in the fleet. Occasional might happen for most of the devices in the fleet once in a while, all the way to frequent, happens almost all the time. Now, these can be based on incidences per time in service. Think of pacemaker, where it's just sitting and just doing its job continuously for an extended period. It could be number of uses or treatments. For instance, a stapler or a cauterizing tool. You'd count it on the number of treatments. Or disposables used, like a syringe in a wearable infusion pump would be an example of another way to rank the probabilities. It's entirely up to your leadership and your team to figure out how to rank this and set this up. And if you notice here that the scaling of the percentage ratio is so roughly scales in orders of magnitude. Improbable improbable is 10 times less likely roughly than remote. Remote is roughly 10 times less likely than occasional, et cetera. Once you get to probable and frequent, it starts to become more like a factor of 2 is kind of how we do it. That usually works for us. And then your combination of severity and probability is a matrix, is usually how it's constructed, where you list off, you've got all your different severity levels and all your different probability levels, and you go through it as an organization, decide what combinations are acceptable and what combinations are not acceptable. And then you use those terms to, you populate your analysis with those terms in those respective columns, and your risk is populated based on what's in this matrix, and that's how you do that stuff. Often these severities and probabilities are established on an organizational basis. They can also be established on a product or a product type basis. It's entirely dependent on what the greater team thinks is prudent for that application.
Okay, great. Thank you. We have a question around testing the failure envelope. So shouldn't part of the risk management be determining testing the failure envelope of the design parameters and some 1.25 or 1.5 safety margin beyond the use design intent?
You can do that a couple of different ways. You can embed that in your requirements, your design requirements. You can embed that in your test plan, your qualification test plan. I don't know that you necessarily need to have that explicitly stated in your risk control file. But absolutely, yeah, if you want to demonstrate margin of safety, I wouldn't necessarily specify it as a requirement because not everywhere is going to be able to utilize the same margin. Like, how do you apply that margin to software? It has no meaning. But you can definitely ensconce that. I would recommend you consider ensconcing that in your test, your qualification test plan.
Okay, great. I do have a couple questions here on regional or country differences, global differences for risk approaches. So I'm just going to combine them, and apologies, but I'm kind of summarizing a couple of these together. So for example, are there regional difference, and specifically, does the EU require the risk be controlled as far as possible?
Yep. Yeah, this is, to my knowledge, the only regulatory language that elaborates on 14971 is part 10.22 of the MDR, which states any risks associated with the device must be reduced as far as possible. This particular language is related to that annex I mentioned earlier, ZA of BSEN 14971. And it's been implied to mean that every failure mode or hazard must have risk controls applied. I think the consensus among industry people I've spoken with is that's not necessarily what it's intended to do. Really, what it was supposed to be for is to make sure that you don't withhold a viable risk control measure just for economic or financial reasons. You can't use that as an excuse not to do the right thing. I've been fortunate that every program I've ever worked on, the question of the cost of a risk control has never come up, but that's not always the case. And that's what the EU really wants to make sure happens, is that you don't pull any punches just because it's going to cost you something. So that's really the only one. Now, I'm sure that this is tacitly the same kind of thinking on the part of the FDA, but it's not explicitly stated in anything I've read. But based on the reviews that the FDA has subjected my products to, they think the same way. It's just not stated quite so overtly.
Okay, great. What about your take, Chris, on changing the severity after implementation of the controls?
Well, as I mentioned, if you've got a risk control that definitely interrupts the sequence of events, I don't necessarily have a problem with that at all. And I would spell that out in the notes about how that works and make it very, very clear. I generally don't do that as a rule. Certainly not willy-nilly. I want to make sure that there's a really strong, solid, irrefutable argument for why that's justified. But where it's justified, it absolutely is appropriate. This is kind of the underlying theme behind intrinsically safe design. If you make a device so it's intrinsically safe so that certain hazards can't exist, say so. Take advantage of it.
Okay. And can you expand a little bit on what is acceptable to reduce the severity level of the FMEA?
Well, in the street example, like I said, is you could use pedestrian causeways for crossing over streets. Now, that's not always appropriate. In a residential area, that would be a big hassle. It really is based on an application specific case. I couldn't give you any specific examples. It would depend on what product we're talking about. But there certainly, like I said, is if you could simply say, here's the sequence of events, read through it, make sure it's verbose enough to make it very, very clear what has to happen for that hazardous situation to lead to a harm. If you can break that chain using a risk control, and you can prove that that risk control does break that chain, then you can justify changing that severity.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask a question shifting into post-market surveillance activities. So in regard to that, they're specifically looking for using risk levels to decide whether an action is required to reduce complaints, knowing that we have both the hazard analysis and the FMEA. So they're asking, do you recommend using the hazard analysis table to make that determination instead of FMEAs? All right, folks. Well, I apologize. It looks like we lost Chris. He might be jumping on here back in a second, but we only had about 5 minutes left. So we will make sure to get your questions to Sunrise Labs, all those that we didn't get a chance to answer live, and I'm sure they will follow up with you after the webinar. Again, thank you for attending. Thank you to Chris for his expertise. Thank you to Sunrise Labs for sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us. And I do encourage you to check out massmedic.com/events and see all the other great events we have coming up. And I encourage you to come to a future event. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.